I guess I don't understand the notion of the Incarnation, for one thing. I don't understand the notion of the Trinity. I don't think either of those make any sense. I don't understand the message of salvation that Christianity teaches. I don't understand the notion of the afterlife that it offers. I don't understand the notion of the moral theory that underlines it to make any sense either. So, they're not arguments to show that it's false, but they're reasons why I don't think that it's true.
I've heard you in a few conversations say either that you thought divine conceptualism was incoherent, or at the very least that you didn't think it was a plausible view, and you outlined brief arguments against it. Could you go over a few of those for me right now?
So first paper I published last year was on divine conceptualism. So that's a paper called Problems for the Argument from Logic. So basically in that I'm looking at a version of an argument that's supposed to show that God exists from the nature of logic, right? And the way that it goes is basically that propositional objects, propositions, I guess, are intentional. And what that means is they are about things, right? So like the proposition Quine was a philosopher is about Quine, right? So it has this kind of quality of aboutness. And they say anything that's intentional is a thought, right? Because clearly thoughts are intentional. They're about things. And there's this kind of tradition that goes back to Brentano, where he's saying like intentionality is the mark of the mental. So anything that's intentional is sort of ipso facto something that's mental. And they say, well, look, a proposition like the law of logic is a necessary thought, right? It's intentional and it's necessarily true. So it's a necessarily existing intentional object. So it's a necessarily existing thought. And basically, necessarily existing thoughts can't be held by contingently existing beings. So they have to be held by a necessarily existing mind. So that's basically the way that you get from propositions or specific, necessary propositions, such as laws of logic or whatever, to the existence of a God. And so the idea is that abstract objects like propositions or whatever are to be conceived as entities in God's mind. And that's the thesis of divine conceptualism. So it's an account of abstract objects, which says that they're divine thoughts. There's a number of things about that that are problematic, but I suppose kind of the central one is the thought. So so the proposition is supposed to be that God thinks things, and those thoughts are propositions. That's the account we're given of abstract objects according to divine conceptualism. That's what divine conceptualism is. And so the way I'm thinking about it is, take a specific instance of God thinking something. So let's consider the proposition, let's call it P, and that proposition is the entity that is the Pythagorean theorem, right? So the theorem about the length of the sides of a right-angled triangle. Because that's a proposition, and according to divine conceptualism, all propositions are divine thoughts, right? So it follows that there would be a thought that's the Pythagorean theorem. Now, it seems to me we should be able to ask, well, what's the thought about that God's having there, right? Because thoughts are intentional, they're about things. So what's it about, right? Well, this is where you kind of run into a problem, because it seems like it can't be that the thought is about triangles having no sides. Sorry, having no sides. What am I chatting about? It can't be about the thought can't be about the right angle, the lengths of right angled triangles. And the reason is because that would just mean that the thought has itself as its own content, right? And whilst you can think about a thought can't have itself as its own content, right? Like if you are thinking about something and then you become aware of thinking about something, what you're actually doing is a new thought has the old thought as its content. But it really doesn't make any sense to say that a thought has itself as its own content. So that kind of rules out the obvious candidate of what you would think the divine thought that is the Pythagorean theorem has as its content. But then there's just really no good answer for what else it could have as its own content. Does it have some other content? Is it about propositions not being true with their own negations or something? I mean, the problem with that is it's got nothing to do with the Pythagorean theorem. And then we're wondering, well, why is that? Why should we take it that thought really was the Pythagorean theorem rather than some other abstract object, right? It just seems like we've got an arbitrary connection between them. The only other sort of desperate recourse we might think is it just doesn't have any content. But then, that just makes it worse almost, because why think it's a thought at all, right? A thought with no content doesn't seem to be a thought either. So, I can develop that a bit more, but I recommend you have a look at the paper where I take time to spell out the reasoning there in more sort of nuanced terms. But basically, the idea is that when you hold a magnifying glass up to the account of abstract objects that's given, we end up either seeing something like an incoherent account of what it means for God's thoughts to be abstract objects, or it just leaves us with a model of God having thoughts. Well, maybe you say something like, well, look, God's thoughts are different to human thoughts, right? So they don't have to be exactly the same. And that's fine. It's just that then the starting point is supposed to be that we can see that the abstract objects are thoughts precisely because they resemble our own thoughts, right? And the intentionality or whatever is the thing that clues us in on why they would be like that in the first place. So if at the end of the reasoning, the divine conceptualist retreats to this notion of sort of alien-like, radically different notion of what it is to be a thought on the divine conceptualist model, then they've kind of lost the beginning bit of their argument where they say it's reasonable to think that propositions are mental entities. And going on in the background is my preferred Platonistic account of propositions instead, which, it just seems reasonable to suppose that it's not the case that every intentional object is mental, and that in fact there are some intentional objects that are non-mental, right, like propositions. As long as we have a third type of thing, in addition to physical objects and abstract objects and mental objects, which is the third thing would be abstract objects, then we've got no problem there. So it feels like there's a much more straightforward account on the table, and the theistic one doesn't seem like it makes any sense. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding of where I was coming from.
Okay, yeah, that's really good, actually. Thanks. Yeah, I'm not really committed to arguing to the existence of God from abstract objects. I was just interested in like a general account of like what their issues might be, and that helps me a lot. Thanks.
And the paper is called Problems for the Argument from Logic, I think. The Problems from the Argument from Logic. I can't remember what I called it. I'll look it up.
Is that on Academia?
Yeah, I think it is. It's on my Phil papers. If you look up Phil papers and search for me, you'll find it there.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Is my mic working, by the way, guys? I'm just experimenting, so if it just goes haywire, just let me know. Anyways, Dr. Malpass, one of the questions that was asked, when to be asked, was about cosmological arguments. Do you believe that all cosmological arguments fail? You obviously concentrated on the Kalam, and you've given reasons why. Almost everybody who's informed has read your paper, at least heard of it. But do you believe that all cosmological arguments suffer from some kind of a flaw, and is it time to retire them? Can you elaborate on that?
I don't really tend to make some like those types of sweeping generalizations about these sorts of issues. I mean, it's more a question of what you've spent time looking at and the conclusions you come to about those specific things, rather than saying, I don't know, all what we're talking about, all possible cosmological arguments. I don't know, and it's not. I haven't looked at all of them in equal depth, so I wouldn't be able to make a claim that applied to all of them equally. So I'm going to beg off just saying anything about a claim that strong. I mean, for all I know, they all. I mean, my inclination is to think that there aren't any arguments that prove the existence of God with anything like. I think it's probably not the sort of thing that we would be able to settle from the armchair. I'm just kind of skeptical about that. I don't claim to know that or be able to demonstrate to you, if you disagreed with me about it, that I was right and you were wrong. That's just where I start from. I'm just skeptical about that proposition in general, whether it's cosmological argument from logic, argument from morality, whatever. I don't think any of those face good prospects before I start looking at them. And I guess that's kind of born out of looking at loads of different arguments for God and always finding some reason or another why it's not very persuasive, or why it seems wrong or something. So I guess I suspect that's the case, but I wouldn't, try and make the case they're all definitely wrong or anything like that.
I see. Sasha, go ahead. Ask on mic. Sasha?
Oh, hello. Sorry. Yeah, my question is about your paper about the Creamy Reaper paradox, the recent one, which you've, I think, discussed with Josh Rasmussen recently. So I think you're basically saying that there are a combination principle that allows you to kind of draw the clocks or the reapers from infinite words, allows you to just create an infinite path, right? And Rasmussen's response was something along the lines of, well, it's categorically different to draw from a finite number of words and the infinite amount of words that you would need to create an infinite past. But I'm just thinking that, like, if he accepts a possible world with an infinite future, you could just draw the infinite past from that world, right? That seems sufficient. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or I know a different objection to his response.
Well, it's true that in certain places, Josh is quite happy to reference like conceivability considerations as being enough to motivate at least a weak claim of metaphysical possibility. For instance, he has a paper called, I think, something like a new cosmological argument or something along those lines. And in there, he argues that there's a premise which is something like it's possible that every event has a cause or something along those lines. And the motivation for that is really just that it's conceivable, that it's true. And we're supposed to take it that that's enough to at least get on the table the thought that that's metaphysically possible. And what you're doing, it seems to me, is simply saying something like, given the infinite future, I can sort of just conceive of that pointing in the other direction or whatever, and that's enough to get it onto the table that it's metaphysically possible that the past is infinite. And that seems kind of right to me. I still haven't made my mind up about I guess I just think I'm not sure if I see that there's much difference between, well, sorry, let me try and gather my thoughts a bit. So when it comes to recombination principles supposedly trying to tell you what's metaphysically possible, I think there's an interesting question about, like, if you can incrementally move from something that seems reasonable through to something that seems unreasonable, and that none of those steps has any principled, like, stopping point, then there is some kind of interesting challenge there. It's like a Sorites paradox or something. My view on that is that there is a principled reason to stop the increments at the first stage, which I was outlining when we talked. Basically, if you're talking about an infinite past that's devoid of, say, Reapers or whatever, or that has Grim Reapers set up so that they wake up or whatever. One wakes up each year on January the 1st to check to see if Fred's alive or whatever scenario we want to think about, but then does nothing anyway, whatever happens, and just goes back to sleep again. That seems perfectly fine. But then someone might say, well, what if that's all true, but instead of just going back to sleep, no matter what, they only go back to sleep if Fred's already dead, and if Fred's alive, they kill him. And it seems like what you've made is just a little change. And in a way, it is a little change, but there's no point in time at which that change can be made. What has to happen is you're just talking about an infinite universe which has always been different from this one, the one we started in. And what's going on is it's not like saying, oh, what if one person made a different choice, the butterfly effect, or like what if one coin landed different from the way that it landed in the actual world. There's no way you can trace back the history of the actual world to a kind of branching point where things would have gone differently. And that leads you to the new possibility that we're considering. What we're talking about is just a possible world that doesn't overlap with the actual world at any point in its history. And you see, to me, that's the point where I start to say, well, now metaphysical possibility is grounded in the actual world. And there's good reasons to think that's right. But given that, what you're talking about isn't a small incremental change, it's actually a change from the actual world to a world that's not metaphysically possible. So it just seems to me that it doesn't really matter about your modal recombination principle. If we're talking about metaphysical possibility, it just doesn't work, right? There's kind of geometric sense in which and it seems to me that just trumps whatever intuition you have about recombination of modal alternatives or something. So I'm not really inclined to think that there's much to turn my head in the other direction. And then when it comes to logical possibility, I mean, any consistent set of propositions is logically possible, and no inconsistent set of propositions is logically possible. And that's it. There's nothing else to say about it. And it doesn't really matter if you start with a consistent set, add one proposition, even if it's a small proposition, it's not much different to the original one. It doesn't matter if there's a big difference or a small difference. The only thing that matters is that set consistent, internally consistent. If it is, it's logically possible. If not, it's not. I just think at some point you're going to add, if we start off with a consistent set of propositions and end with an inconsistent one, at some point we add in a proposition that contradicts one of the ones we already had. And that's the point where it goes wrong. So it would be a completely black and white process. And it would just be a question of paying careful attention to what the set of propositions was at each point. So it doesn't work with logical possibility. At some point, the chain of inferences would just have a false one in when you introduce a proposition that conflicts with the previous ones. And if it's metaphysical possibility, it's right at the beginning when you try to imagine that the actual past is infinite but non-contradictory, and then you try and modulate that into an actual infinite past, which is different at every point in the past, because that's just not metaphysically possible from the actual world. So I'm not sure if I answered your question there or not really, but
yeah, I think that helps.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, thank you so much. Tom Mobile wants to again ask on mic. Tom.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, hi, Dr. Malpass. It's Tom. I wanted to ask you a question because I recently spoke to Steve McRae about his WASP argument. And he invoked your name when he was telling me how the argument is unassailable, and basically was saying that you signed off on it. So I wanted to ask, because I have certain questions about the argument. I personally think that a defeater to his argument, well, there's a problem with it. I think that it needs a premise first where, some sort of relationship between the words atheism and theism is established. And I think without that established, there's nothing that you're going to be able to derive from the argument, right? I'm not sure if you recall off the top of your head the argument, but
I don't know.
Well, basically, it's something like if you lack a belief in theism, and that's atheism. Conversely, if you lack a belief in atheism, then that's a theist, right? Does that ring a bell?
And you're telling me that's Steve's position?
That's the gist of the argument, yeah. So unless the atheist is also willing to accept the term of, you're also a theist if you lack a belief in atheism, then they would be special pleading, according to Steve.
I mean, I thought Steve was of the opinion that, the correct, whatever that means, definition of the term atheist is someone who believes that God doesn't exist, not someone who just lacks a belief. But the way you put it,
that is correct. Yes.
So sorry, I must have misunderstood. Remind me of the first premise again.
Well, I don't know exactly how he puts it in a syllogism, but
well, the first thing you said, I thought you said that according to Steve, someone who lacks a belief in theism is an atheist, and someone who lacks a belief in atheism is a theist. But then that just sounds like someone who lacks a belief that God exists is an atheist. But that's different from believing that God doesn't exist. But
correct.
If he's the type of person who thinks that an atheist is someone who positively believes that God doesn't exist, then it can't be that his argument is that the definition of an atheist is someone who merely lacks a belief in theism. Those two things would be contradictory. I mean, it's just, on the one hand, it's the kind of philosophical definition and also the kind of new atheist definition. It can't be both of those, presumably. So either you're misrepresenting the argument there, or I don't know, maybe Steve's muddled the way he presented it or something, but that doesn't seem right.
Right. I agree. I talked with him a bit about this, but in my opinion, when he's going to have a conclusion where it is special pleading, that sounds to me like an internal critique, and to use, if you're going to internal critique, then you have to use their definition. And this is an argument basically against the lacktheist, but he's not using the lacktheist definition of atheism. So I don't understand how he's going to conclude with a conclusion of your special pleading. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think I can't say much about this because I can't remember the premises. I'm not quite sure you can either, unless you want to go and get it and come back or something. I'd be happy to talk about it, but I think it would help to actually have the argument in front of us so that we can sort of look at the premises.
Yeah, I think you had the gist of it, the first two premises, and then the conclusion is just going to be something like, unless the lacktheist accepts the label of theist in virtue of them lacking a belief in atheism, then they are guilty of special pleading. That would be the conclusion.
So it's supposed to be
something like, one is an atheist if they lack a belief in theism. One is a theist if they lack a belief in atheism. Conclusion: if you don't accept the label of theist, then you're special pleading. Something like that.
Why is it special pleading?
Well, I don't really know. That's what I've been trying to ask him. But It's just I think that if he had some look, they're words, right? And words don't have meanings, admittedly by him. Words have usages. So if you're talking to a lacktheist, right? If you get the lacktheist to say atheist and theist have this converse relationship, then I think this argument works. But without that, I don't think it works. I mean, because this is all just being derived on, this utterance right here usually follows this linguistic convention or something like that. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this just, the thing about this topic is that it doesn't really matter. Like, nothing hangs.
No, I agree. I absolutely agree. Yeah.
Do we call this one thing or another? And I do understand that there are people on the internet who spend a lot of time talking about it, and anything can be meaningful to someone. But I'm just, it just doesn't really interest me at all. I mean, I just don't really care. So if you want to call me an atheist, that's fine. If you don't, then that's also fine. It doesn't matter. As long as my views are clear, I don't really care what the label is. So just don't care.
Absolutely.
About this, really.
Right. I think the argument is kind of interesting because it kind of falls prey, I think, to sort of like the mixing of language with like pure logic. And instead of using just logical operators, he actually inputs atheism and theism. And when I asked him, they're supposed to represent X and not X. But I mean, if you're talking to a lacktheist, then they don't think atheism is not X. They think it's like Y or something.
Okay, I mean, but I'm not sure what much more I have to say about this. As I said, it's one of those things that just seems too much time has already been spent on the internet talking about lacktheism and atheism. And yeah, I mean, I guess there's a kind of sociological thing that's a bit more interesting about like the movement of people who adopt one definition for non-philosophical purposes.
Well, I won't take up any of your time. I agree that when I approach these things, I just really care what they mean. I'm not really trying to explore it in that way, like there's some sort of substance to this at all. And the only reason I brought it up is because, Steve brought you up as far as the logic and stuff. So that's all. So I appreciate your answer, and thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I can't be much more help. But for all I can gather, maybe I do sign off on it, maybe I don't. I'd have to look in the detail of what he was saying to be sure about it. But either way, I mean, I am sure that it just doesn't seem worth spending the time to get like super precise about something like this, because nothing really hangs on it as far as I can see. Nothing interesting hangs on it. So I'm interested to not spend my time on that if I can. So yeah.
Okay. Dr. Malpass, you have concentrated on I guess challenging.
Alex is basically telling you to fuck off, Tom.
Yeah. I'm not. But I am happy to never talk about that precise sort of debate.
Yeah, that's a boring topic.
But if you send something to him, Tom, he won't be able to help himself. So if you really want to waste his time, just make sure to send him everything you can about it.
No, I don't. Look, I don't have any interest in exploring like the definition of atheism. I just think that this has been talked about so much, and Steve has been going around saying that this is unassailable. I think it's got a clear issue, and that was my interest in it. But I mean, I don't want to.
That's fine as well. I mean, people are, the internet's full of people saying all sorts of things, and despite Josh's jibe or whatever, I'm not compulsively, or compelled to respond to just somebody making a claim, even if they say that I back it up or something. And I think it's kind of like the right way to think about it. Lots of people, think that all sorts of things is a super big deal, and that's okay. And like a lot of them can be wrong, and that's fine. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Not that that's what I'm saying. You're being wrong about it or anything, but like, yeah, there are people out there on the internet who say all sorts of crazy stuff super confidently, and yeah.
Well, I'm actually kind of reminded of one thing I just want to add real quick, because I gave him the example of credible and incredible, and it's by looking at the words and knowing linguistic conventions, we think that they have, from the in, right, it suggests some sort of opposite relation, right? But I'm sure we all know that credible and incredible don't have an opposite relation, right? So that's what I think he's doing in a similar way with atheism and theism. And unless you get whoever you're rendering this argument to sign off that these have this relationship of they're like opposites, then you can't derive any of the other stuff.
Yeah, okay. So there'd have to be that agreement that they were direct opposites or something.
Right. So if you say, hey, you think incredible are opposites, and they say, yeah, then yeah, you're not really making sense. Right.
Okay.
Anyways, carry on.
See, he wasn't able to resist. You saw that, right?
Alex, you have. I hope my microphone is working, by the way. Alex, you have concentrated on, I guess, challenging the second premise of William Lane Craig's Clum argument. However, Dr. Craig actually has a... Yeah, we'll get to this. Dr. Craig actually has additional premises after the three-premise argument. And those additional premises are what has been known as the teleological arm of the argument, or perhaps a new teleological argument on its own, and it goes something like this. The universe, after he presumably establishes that there is a cause, the cause of the universe, or the universe here, either because of chance, necessity, or design. It's not chance or necessity, therefore it's design. How would you challenge that argument if you're familiar with it, and what are some of your objections?
So you're talking about the fine-tuning argument there at that point?
Yes, but the William Lane Craig version of it.
Right. So, I mean, the thing is, the way he puts it is just a kind of disjunctive syllogism, effectively, but with three options. It's either A, B, or C. It's not A or B, so it's C. And I guess I'm not convinced about what he says. I mean, that argument itself is, so simplistic that it's kind of trivial. Like, it's all about, well, why isn't it A or why isn't it B? And that's the bit where there's philosophical interest in there. And why isn't it necessity? Why isn't? I mean, I'm not a big fan of the idea that it was chance. So what we're talking about is the seemingly precise nature of the constants or whatever and values in fundamental physics, and it's sort of widely acknowledged that if you were to vary those the values of those constants by even a tiny amount, then the world would be kind of radically inhospitable to kind of life as we know it, at least. I kind of think, I mean, there's loads of interesting things about that idea. I think the Robin Collins version of the argument is a lot more interesting than Craig's version, because, as I said, Craig's argument just is a simple syllogism, and then it's all a lot of it's all about the support of those premises. Collins's argument at least describes it in probabilistic terms and makes a far less ambitious claim, which makes it easier to defend. So, I mean, I don't think Craig's a particularly good or interesting representation of fine-tuning argument. I think there's other people to look at there. But I mean, it's not quite clear, although some people think that they can show this. It's not quite clear to me that it has been shown that fair enough, like just on the periphery of the actual world, if we vary the constants, that fair enough that it's not hospitable to life. Change the gravitational constant by a tiny amount, and stars can't form or whatever, blah, blah, blah. But if you vary lots of them a lot, what we're talking about is a kind of many-dimensional space of possibilities with a bunch of values that can take any real number. So there's a ton of combinations there. And one way to think about it is the precise kind of range of possibility around the actual world is incredibly small. So if you think about the space of possibilities, that varying these, let's say 20 values along some interval of a real number line, there's an enormous 20-dimensional space around that almost point of actuality that we live in. And the thought that we've mapped that whole 20-dimensional space down to the level of being able to see if there was even a point-like area like the one that we live in, and being able to confidently say that there are no such places like that, doesn't seem right. I mean, just because on the outside of this area things are inhospitable to life, doesn't mean that when you recombine things, some very weird alien form of life couldn't operate. And it, I don't know, and I submit that it's difficult to say that anybody could be confident about this, that we don't know what's possible very far away from what the actual world is like. And this is all to assume that varying those constants is itself possible. It may be that those constants can't take every value, or indeed any other values. It's not like there's a manual somewhere for building possible space of how things could have been, and that it's definitely constructed by tinkering with all these dials. It's a nice thought that you could do that, but nobody knows whether that's right or not. So it could be that this is the only combination those dials can take. William Lane Craig certainly doesn't know anything about true or not, because nobody does. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's loads of more interesting, kind of more rigorous and nuanced things to say about the fine-tuning argument, but that's a little bit of. I mean, I did a debate with Luke Barnes on capturing Christianity, and I laid out some thoughts there in more detail than I am here. So if anyone's interested in that, they could go to there, have a look at it.
Okay, I see. Thank you so much, Dr. Malpass. Yeetus, come on, Mike.
Yeah. So I guess my main question was, you know what, like, I mean, obviously, you know what infinite regression is. How do you respond to like the argument whether time is like infinite or finite? Yeah.
So which argument do you mean though?
So the argument that time is finite, in the Kalam by like William Lane Craig, I guess, or one of the branches of the Kalam, states that time is finite because if there's like a now, then there would have to be like a finite causal history or a finite temporal history. How would you like respond to that, I guess?
I mean, okay, so one version of that argument is, so there's various different ways you could put it. So one argument, which goes back to Philoponus, is something like, if there was an infinite past, then it would have taken the present an infinite amount of time to get here. But an infinite amount of time, if it took an infinite amount of time for the present to get here, it would still be on its way, right? It would never have managed to complete that, because you can't complete an infinite distance or whatever. You can't traverse the infinite. So yeah, then that's why the past must have a beginning. So the crucial part of that is that the present would have had to have traversed an actual infinite, and that this can't be done. And you might think, well, why can't you do that? Well, why is it that you can't traverse the infinite? Well, give me an argument for that. And if you do, then normally what people will say, people like Craig will say, well, look, you can't count to infinity, right? If you start counting now, no matter how long you count for, you won't have like got to infinity or whatever. You'll still only be counting a finite number. So, and that's what it means, that you can't traverse the infinite. So that's why the present couldn't have traversed the infinite past to get here. And that's fine, except that counting up is a process that starts, and it's infinite because it has no end to it. It has a beginning, but it doesn't have an end. And what we're looking at when it comes to the present moment traversing the infinite past would be a process that has an end, as in when the present arrives here, whatever, not even sure what we're supposed to say about the moving now or whatever. But anyway, let's suppose that it's some kind of spatial metaphor about the moving now. The process is finished when it arrives here at this very moment. So it's a beginningless series that does have an end. And I'm skeptical that you can make successful inference from the impossibility of getting to the end of an endless sequence, that you can then infer straight over from that to the impossibility of getting to the end of a beginningless sequence, because, I mean, it does have an end. So if you think about, imagine you're trying to climb to the top of a mountain that's infinitely high, right? And so high, in fact, that it doesn't have an end. It's an endless mountain. So there is no crest at the top of it. It's got a base camp, and you start at the base camp, and you're like, I'm going to get to the top of the infinite mountain. Now, I could just stop you right there before you even bother starting and say, look, there is no end, right? It doesn't have an end. So it's not that it's too tall for you to get to. I mean, it is too tall, right? But it's just, there isn't an end where there's no destination. It's like saying, I'm going to get to the end of the earth. You just keep going round and round and round because there isn't an end, right? It's like some objects don't have an end, and that's okay, right? But it just means you're not going to succeed in that task. You're looking for something that's not there. But now picture a different mountain that's also equally high, but it does have an end. It just doesn't have a beginning. It doesn't have a base camp. Now, as long as you're already on the journey of climbing up that mountain, it's not false to say that you could get to the end. It's true you could get to the end. It does have an end. I mean, it might be millions of miles away, but in principle, you could get to it because there it is, right? As long as you kept climbing for long enough, you'd get there. So there's some reason to think you're not going to succeed in getting to the top of the endless mountain. That's not present when you're climbing up the beginningless mountain. And obviously, when we're talking about the beginningless past, what we actually need is something that explains why you can't traverse an infinite like that, which doesn't end up just being a reason for why you can't traverse an endless sequence. So my diagnosis of those arguments is that Craig always talks a good talk about how you can't count to infinity, and then just sort of tells you that that must apply to the beginningless sequence. But he's not clear about why we should agree with him there. And I think there's good reasons to think that those considerations about not getting to the end of the endless don't actually help. So yeah, that's why. I mean, I'm not saying the past is beginningless or anything really. I'm just saying that those arguments don't show you anything. Yeah. Does that help?
Oh, sorry. So I guess the question I would say is, or the way like William Lane Craig puts it is, like, are you able to count from negative infinity to zero? Because nothing finite can be taken out of infinity. If you divide infinity by infinity, it will still equal infinity. Like, there are no finite numbers that can be taken out of infinity, I guess.
I mean, I'm not sure what it means to take a finite number out of infinity. You could have an infinite set of things and remove a finite number of them, and there'll still be an infinite number left. Maybe that's what you mean. But look, why can't a guy count down from, I mean, let's just be clear that they're not starting at minus infinity, right? There's no starting point at all. So long as there isn't a starting point. So picture it like this. So you come across someone and they're saying, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, phew, I finished or whatever. And then you ask them what they've been doing, and they say, I've just been counting down forever, and I've just finished, and I've counted through all of the natural numbers backwards, and I finished now. And you say, when did you start? And he said, I didn't start. I've just always been doing it, and I've just finished now. Now, what's wrong with that, right? Like, it's weird. Of course, it's super weird, and I don't think it's physically possible. But why is it logically impossible? Right? What's actually contradictory about it? And you can't say, well, you can't get to you can't count up to infinity or something. Like, sure, you can't do that, but show me what's wrong with this example. So I actually think that the counting down case is just another example of the thing we're supposed to be given an explanation for why that's impossible. It's not an example of it being impossible. It's something that should be explained as being impossible, which we never actually get. It's a kind of promissory note that says, just buy this stuff about counting up being impossible, and that will do. That will be enough to get you the thing about counting down being impossible. So I don't think that case makes any difference. It's the same thing.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. Alex, I also wanted to kind of change it a little bit and ask, the chat wanted to ask a question. What are your objections to pragmatism? Like, do you have any specific, or is that something you just don't spend a lot of time researching? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have anything interesting to say about it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
I forgot who wanted to come on mic. Just, if anybody, just remind me. Some of these people. But yeah, basically, this is the question. What are your, oh, Josh, go ahead. Isn't Josh unmuted?
Yeah. I just had to get to the mic. I don't remember if we ever talked about this before, but since I don't remember your answer anyway, I was just going to ask again. What do you think about when Craig says that mathematicians sort of arbitrarily dismiss certain operations with infinite sets and just say that they're impossible? I don't remember exactly what he says, but he tries to give this argument that actual infinities are incoherent, because if you took infinity minus infinity, you'd get 1, but you'd also get 2, and you get contradictory results or whatever. And so I've heard him say in talks and stuff before that it's completely arbitrary, that you can't perform those those arithmetic operations that you normally perform on ordinal numbers on infinite sets or whatever. What do you think about what he says?
Yeah, so there's a good explanation for what's going on there that I can't quite remember, but that it's to do with, in set theory, it's what you're not doing arithmetic anymore, right? Because arithmetic is a set of operations where the domain is the natural numbers, and what you're doing when you're doing seemingly similar operations on let's call them infinite numbers or something, is you're actually just doing set theory. And then what you've got to do is work out what you mean by which set theoretical operation is it that's supposed to be subtraction and multiplication and blah blah blah. And it's pretty obvious that the union of two sets is addition. Is that right? Fuck, I can't even remember now. I can't even remember these basic aspects of this explanation. And the intersection is subtraction or something. God damn it. But so I can't explain this properly, but nonetheless, a few years back I could have explained this much better, and there is a good explanation for this. But basically, when you cash it out in set theoretic terms, there's a satisfying explanation of why it doesn't make any sense to why, when what you're looking at is an infinite set, that subtraction isn't well defined or whatever, something about that. And I'm fudging this explanation. All I'm really doing, there is a set theoretical explanation out there of what's going on, and the key to understand it is that it doesn't make any sense to talk about subtraction in the properly arithmetical sense when you're looking at transfinite arithmetic. You've got to do set theory, and then at that point you're doing near translations of arithmetical concepts into set theoretic ones, and it's in that translation that you've got to understand what's going on at the level of those set theoretical functions to see why that subtraction, or whichever one it is that's not well defined, is like that. And it's not simply just a case of saying, oh, we'd be in big trouble if this operation was allowed, let's just prohibit it so that we don't get into trouble. It's not that at all. There's a completely straightforward sense in where you would do that regardless of what your motivations were, just because that's obviously what's going on. So I don't know what Craig's thinking about when he says that, if he's just wrong or if he's trying to be deceptive or whatever, I don't know. But I think it's just wrong to say, paint it a picture of like people just prohibiting for the sake of having Cantorian paradise. So not that helpful. I'm pointing at a thing I can't describe properly to you, but you have to take my word for it.
Yeah, we call that hand waving, or mere hand waving.
Mere hand waving, yes, good. Waffling is another way of putting that. Not quite bullshitting, though. I think that's fair to say.
It sounds good to me. I mean,
okay, good.
Yeah. Dr. Malpass, a lot of work has, specifically Dr. Graham Oppie has spent a lot of work, actually. I think that's how he started getting into philosophy of religion, by exploring the modal ontological argument. But I don't remember ever hearing your analysis. So what are some of your objections to how Plantinga formulates the modal ontological argument? And do you believe that it is, in fact, question-begging? Do you believe it commits some kind of a fallacy? Or do you simply find the conclusion unconvincing? Like, I've never seen you flesh it.
I actually agree with Plantinga's own assessment of that argument. It's unpersuasive to you, already persuaded by the conclusion, so it's dialectically pointless. He admits that himself. I think it's in The Nature of Necessity that he says that. So basically, the thought is there's this like symmetry or parity argument. So basically, the argument is something like, if it's possible that God exists, then God exists because God is a necessary, like by definition or whatever, a necessarily existing being, perfect being with all the great-making properties, and existence is a great-making property, blah, blah, blah. If it's possible that a being like that exists, then it exists in all possible worlds. So if it's not possible that a being like that exists, then it's impossible that it exists, right? It's not contingent. It's got to be one way or the other. And surely it's possible. And if that's all you give it, that in one possible world something like that exists, then it exists in all possible worlds, therefore it exists in the actual world, right? That's the argument. I mean, there's a lot more to it. Nature and Necessity is actually quite an interesting book. And it goes through it in painstaking detail. I've just rushed through it. And there's a whole theory of modality, which is quite interesting as well. But anyway, look, the thing that he recognizes is that there's a parity argument, which is to say, if it's even possible that God doesn't exist, then he doesn't exist in every single possible world, therefore in the actual world. And surely it's possible that God doesn't exist. And so what should we have any reason to favor one of those possibility claims over the other? Like, should I think it's more likely to be true that it's possible that God exists than that it's possible that God doesn't exist? I mean, of course, if I've already bought the first argument and think that he necessarily exists, then I've got very strong reason to think that it's impossible for him not to exist. And that's a kind of overwhelming defeater for the other side of the fence on this, right? Which is that it's possible that he doesn't exist. But of course, if I've bought the second argument, and I think, well, it's possible he doesn't exist, therefore it's impossible that he does exist, now I've got an overwhelming defeater for the first proposition, which is it's possible that he exists. So the two versions of the argument are completely symmetrical, and they just cancel each other out. So it just does nothing. It's like two waves that are exactly equal and meet each other, and then it just does nothing. So it's just kind of dialectically irrelevant, basically, his version of the argument. it's nice for sort of, if you believe that anyway, to sort of thread out some of the logical relationships there in modal logic or something. It can be. I think it could be illustrative. I mean, if you think that it's possible that God doesn't exist, but that the whole concept of God is a necessarily existent being, then that could explain what's going on in your head when you say it's impossible that God exists. It's just, don't expect anyone to be persuaded by that unless they already agree with you, right? So it can be useful to sort of share with fellow atheists, or theists can share it with fellow theists, but it's just, if the goal is persuasion, then it doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. So, yeah, that's my thought about it, and I think it's the same as Plantinga's. I think he agrees with that. He does agree with that, or at least did agree with that at a certain point.
Well, I see. Thank you, Dr. Malpass. Hound of Heaven wants to get on mic again. Hound, go ahead.
Okay.
By the way, if I missed, sorry, just a second. If I missed anybody, just ping me so you can get on mic. Yeah, go ahead, Hound.
Okay, yeah, I just had another quick question. Do you have any favorite defenses of the possibility of doing metaphysics? Like, I'm reading Real Essentialism right now, and I just finished chapter 2, and it was all about defending like any sort of metaphysical project from certain analytical attacks. Do you have any like papers or books that you think go over that really well?
Over the possibility of metaphysics, you say, the necessity of metaphysics? Yeah.
Or I said possibility. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't really. I mean, it depends what. I guess it's kind of like things floating around in my head that I'm not sure are the same thing that you're asking about, really. So maybe I'm just not following the exact context that you're picking out.
It's just like there are certain usually they're epistemological, but there are like attacks that are made against any kind of attempt at doing metaphysics at all. Like Tom Jump, for example, will say that all metaphysical theories are 100% underdetermined, so there's no way of actually having any idea of whether your theory is correct outside of whether it's like analytically true or not. Like something that would defend against attacks like that, or I don't know. If you don't have anything,
I mean, that type of, so that type of thing is similar to sort of the strong kind of Carnapian kind of early 20th century thought that like all metaphysics is somehow some abuse of epistemology or philosophy of language. And I think that basically what that fails on is an unreasonably strict condition somewhere, which is itself unreasonable. So like, if you're talking about, just to take the kind of Tom Jump thing there, it seems to me that what's going on is an unreasonably strict understanding of what it is the metaphysician is supposed to be doing, right? Like, if what they're supposed to be doing is like proving metaphysical theorems or something that are definitely true, and that anyone who comprehends it would definitely believe that that's true, whatever, then yeah, I kind of agree that like that sort of project, that's an overly ambitious project, is doomed to failure, because I'm not the type of person who thinks kind of like Spinoza or something that you can just like deduce propositions about the nature of the world. Something. Most of my philosophical engagement with metaphysics is like primarily deconstructive. Like, I'm interested in showing why arguments that have a positive claim fail, right? I'm not really the sort of person who puts forwards arguments to establish metaphysical theses. Not to say, I kind of broadly think that it's difficult to do that. At very least, it might be impossible, but I think it's very difficult anyway to establish almost anything in metaphysics beyond the level of like quite speculative and somewhat hand wavy, right? And so like what you end up doing in metaphysics is a lot more messy, and it's talking about like, you know, the balance of like lots of different considerations, having fine distinctions between them, and like weighing things up in a very in a manner where like the methodology is itself a type of objective investigation, criticism. Like, this is messy. It's all over the place. It's not like a field. I don't know, like, you know, who's the best chess player or whatever. Like, there's competitions you can enter, you win points, blah, blah, blah. It's just a fact of the matter that, like, you know, Magnus Carlsen is just the best chess player or whatever. Metaphysics doesn't have any, like, clear boundaries like that. There's no, like, anyone is, anything anyone says could be challenged by anyone, right? Like, you can come into a metaphysics class and disagree with the professor of metaphysics, and really all he's got behind him is like an office and a title, but there's nothing else really. It's all about like making subtle evaluations and thinking about it for yourself. So, I mean, given that that's what metaphysics is, I don't think that it's, you know, I mean, it depends how you look at it. Maybe it is all radically underdetermined and whatnot, but once you kind of like lens into the special type of genre that it is, then I think that you can make that's how it's kind of understood now. Anyways, it's not a kind of a priori project, and once you have a more nuanced and like finely graded kind of way of going about it, that's what kind of contemporary metaphysics is. Much more messy project. It's kind of fun. I mean, it's fun because you can think of like really big ideas and you know, crazy things like, you know, whether all possible worlds are concrete things that actually exist somewhere out there, or whether, you know, contradictions could be true. There's all this like cool, crazy, whether the past is infinite, blah, blah, blah. They're fun ideas, but you know, I don't take it too seriously to the point where I'm like sort of solemnly declaring, you know, this is true, this is the nature of the world, and blah, blah, blah. Very rarely make anything resembling those types of claims. It's fun. I like to sort of go about metaphysics with a sense of exploring something interesting and doing something that I enjoy. And I think I would stop doing it when I don't enjoy it anymore. I'll do something else, because that's what it is for me. It's something I do because I like it. It's not my job, and it's not my income. It's not my. I don't need to do it, but I enjoy doing it. So I don't know. I'm not sure whether I'm veering off now at all.
No, that's good. Thanks. That's all.
Cool.
That's all.
All right, thank you. Dr. Malpass, Mr. Slim J has a question. What are your thoughts on religious presuppositionalists? What are some arguments that you think they use that aren't correct, or what are your main objections? Thank you.
So, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about presuppositionalism, like a few years ago, and I don't think too much about it these days, but I think basically if anyone's interested in presuppositionalism, should really read, there's a couple of papers by this philosopher called Barry Stroud, and what he did was basically, there was a period in like the 60s where in analytic philosophy, transcendental arguments became kind of cool and like fashionable and whatnot. And I kind of think it was because there's some bits of Wittgenstein that look like transcendental arguments, and it got people into it. Like, I think Peter Strawson has some work on transcendental arguments in Kant, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so there's a period where people are thinking about that a lot. And then Stroud came out with this kind of critique of what they were up to, which applies perfectly well to presuppositionalists. And basically the thought is, let's see if I can remember this. So it's like, so let's say somebody's making an argument like this. unless God exists, and then pick a thing, right? Like logic, say, would be impossible. Or they'll say something like, experience would be unintelligible or whatever. So unless God existed, something that you take to be possible or coherent or true or whatever wouldn't be. And that thing is possible or coherent or true. So it must be that God exists, because God is the thing that is presupposed by that thing being possible or coherent or true, right? So that's a transcendental argument. It basically just is presuppositional argument as well. And so what he says is like, look, you've got to distinguish between that relation of presupposition being epistemic or metaphysical, right? So if it's epistemic, maybe epistemic isn't quite the best word for it, but if it's kind of epistemic, anyway, let's call it that. What's going on is you're saying, unless I believe that God exists, then I wouldn't be able to have coherent experience. My experience would be incoherent unless I believed that God exists. And my experience is coherent, right? But then the problem with that is the only thing you're allowed to conclude is that it follows that you believe that God exists, right? So the thing about the epistemic claim is that it doesn't get you as far as you want to go, right? It's not very ambitious. The good thing about the epistemic sort of version of this argument is that it's, modestly plausible. You might, it's at least believable in some cases that there could be things where, unless you held a certain belief, then another type of experience wouldn't be possible. So it might be that, like, unless you believed everything was going to be okay, you wouldn't run into a building and save a baby from dying or whatever. You have to have this belief that may not be true, that everything's going to be fine, or else you wouldn't be able to have that outlook or whatever. So there might be certain types of experience that you can't have unless you hold certain beliefs, whether they're true or not. That's fine. It's just that, you can't say, well, unless I believed everything was going to be all right, the baby out, and I did get the baby out, therefore everything's going to be okay. It actually doesn't follow. Obviously, it just follows that you have a belief. Now, typically, a person making a transcendental argument, it wants to make something a bit more ambitious than that, right? They don't want to just prove the necessity of me having a belief. They want to prove the necessity of the thing my belief is about being true, right? They want to prove that that belief is a true belief. So they'll opt instead for this kind of metaphysical version of that, which is like, it's not unless I believe that God exists, then such and such. It's unless God actually exists, then such and such. But now the problem is, at least that would get us the conclusion would be that God exists. But now the problem is that, so previously the idea was the inference was invalid if you're trying to get all the way to God existing. Well, now the problem is going to be that the second premise is not going to be true. It's going to be an unsound argument rather than an invalid one. The reason it's plausibly unsound is that, like, at least all the work from the person making the argument is still on the table. If they are going to claim that unless some feature of the world, some metaphysical claim about the way that the world is, really is the thing that's the presupposition, really is the necessary condition, the thing that has to be there for you to have some, say, necessary experience of whatever it is. Right? That claim, but a claim between a metaphysical fact being true and the possibility of you having a coherent experience of a certain type, that's actually really difficult to prove, right? Like, or even motivate at all. Like, it's easy to, just take your kind of standard Descartesian argument. Just seems like you could have any type of experience without even anything existing apart from your experience. Right? It seems at least possible. So proving that a certain metaphysically true thing has to obtain for you to have a certain type of experience almost seems hopeless from the start. At least it seems a tall order. And we're obviously, we need a big explanation of why we should take any of those claims to be true, which we're not given. In fact, what's happened, this is where the diagnosis really pays for itself, it seems to me, is that what goes on is a kind of slip and slide between these two. What you're doing is you get someone who offers you a metaphysical, ambitious argument, but then when they come to explain it to you, it turns into a modest epistemic argument. And if you don't notice that, you might, it's much easier to defend the modest premises of the epistemic reading than it is of the metaphysical one. But, so that when they're talking to you about the premises, they'll be talking epistemic, but when they're talking about the conclusion, they're talking about the metaphysical. And unless you notice that sleight of hand is going on, you don't realize that they're making life easier for themselves when they're trying to defend the argument. And what you have to do is sort of expose the fact that there are these two different readings, and which one of them is it in particular that they're actually presenting. So Barry Stroud, and I can't remember what the argument's called, but it's like, maybe I could find it, transcendental arguments or something. Let me see if I can find it. Barry Stroud. Bam, 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 bam. Yeah, Barry Stroud, and it's called Transcendental Arguments. So I recommend reading that if you're interested in that. Don't read anything by like Van Til or Banson or anyone. That's all just garbage. That's not proper philosophy.
Wait, did you say Van Til was garbage?
Yeah.
So you're like familiar with his works?
Yes, I've read plenty.
Oh, so I mean, I'm someone who has been interested in Van Til, just haven't gotten around it. So can you like summarize briefly what you think Van Til's idea was? What do you think is wrong with it?
I mean, Van Til's just an incredibly opaque writer. It's incredibly difficult to know what the hell he's talking about. He's also, and he's writing, not that this necessarily is a bad thing. He's not writing with English as his first language. There's plenty of writers who are in the same boat who manage to write coherently. Of course, tons of European philosophers write English as a second language and are better writers than native English speakers. Van Til is not one of those who writes in incredibly opaque manner, but also just never gave the argument in anything even like as clear a form as I just did. Basically, the whole of Van Til's, he talks about a lot of stuff as well that's nothing to do with this, of course. It's not like his whole career is focused on this one thing, but this is what he's famous for. And a lot of it's just waffly stuff around the edges of never actually giving an argument. And that critique was made during his lifetime as well. So there's lots of people who think that. And I have a book somewhere which is like one of these books where it's like a collection of essays that people in his honor or whatever at the end of his career, and he replies back to each of them. And there's a famous one in there, and I can't even remember who it is, where the guy offers that critique, basically like saying there's just this, we never actually got the argument, at the end of his career, you never actually gave it. And I think at the end of the day, he just offers a kind of, it's a bit like, it's almost an insult, but it could sort of see him as someone a bit like Derrida. And I actually think it's an insult to Derrida because I think he's a much better philosopher. But Derrida was, Jacques Derrida was a very influential French philosopher, sort of postmodernist philosopher, whatever. And he inspired a huge number of people, mainly in English departments rather than philosophy ones, and like architecture and like these sort of peripheral areas to philosophy, to a kind of philosophical movement called deconstruction or whatever. And they didn't really like the word, but lots of people going around talking like Derrida basically and saying a lot of stuff that a lot of other people, a lot of philosophers just thought was like incomprehensible. And I'm kind of inclined to think that actually Derrida was, some bits of Derrida kind of do make sense. I kind of quite like the zany off the wallness of that. But I just come to the conclusion after all these years that, like, looking back on it, there really just isn't anything underneath that Van Tilian search for the argument. I just don't think there is one. And I just think he's not clear enough a thinker to even have like thought that he didn't do it. I think he thought that the stuff he said about it was enough. But it just, from my point of view, it just wasn't enough. and then you just get like a world of people, like, because from Van Til you get Greg Banson, and from Greg Banson you get people Sye Ten Bruggencate and Darth Dawkins and whatever, and all of those people are just like those people who went around talking like Derrida, just aping the shape and whatever of that type of argument, but without the substance behind it. So anyway, yeah, that's what I mean. I can't get super technical about it because it's been many years since I gave up after a while because, yeah, there were more interesting things to look at.
Yeah. I found it very amusing that you said that Van Til was garbage. Yeah, Hannah wants to know, Professor, what if anything would have to occur for you to believe in God?
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult because I don't think I would come to that belief from somebody sort of presenting a syllogism or something, right? That type of thing is basically off the table. I just can't imagine that ever happening. I mean, I guess it's kind of a remote possibility that through studying some piece of philosophy or whatever in great depth, that I would come to change my mind. I think if that was to happen, what I would do is adopt something that wasn't anything like a religious perspective, but just kind of theism of some type, right? I can't imagine considerations of a philosophical argument could ever mean that I would then become like a Presbyterian or whatever. Like, I don't know why I would pick one of those as another. I could sort of just imagine having a vague theism or something, but it would probably be quite a weird, like a lot of people, I'd have my own weird religious belief, I think. I think for me to adopt anything like a kind of religious outlook, something quite drastic would probably have to happen. So like maybe I have a near-death experience, or, someone in my life dies or whatever, and I become traumatized. Or perhaps I almost die, because I get a disease or something and it's the end of my life and I'm scared or something. I think those types of things are the only realistic ways I can see myself ever changing my belief to the point where I adopt anything like a religious outlook. I just think in the kind of sober light of day perspective that I'm in now, I just can't imagine that. It's not a question of like, I don't know enough about like, the modal ontological argument or something like that. That's just a million miles away from what would change my mind about that.
Yeah. Dr. Malpass, the question from Ta Win. Oh, if Hannah wants to respond, that's fine. I guess we'll give her a second to respond. Maybe she wants to. Yes. She just says, thank you so much, Professor. Dr. Malpass, Sye Ten Bruggencate has a very specific form of precept where he basically says, unless you know things, for example, without the possibility of failure, you can't claim to know anything. What do you think about his version of precept? And do you think it's like a valid form to, for example, say that unless you know everything 100%, then you can't know unless somebody who knows it 100% reveals it?
I mean, there's so much wrong. I mean, first of all, the conception of knowledge, like having to know something with 100% certainty or whatever. I mean, so again, we have to distinguish between epistemic and metaphysical notions here. So, I mean, if I believe that 2 + 2 = 4, and it's true that 2 + 2 = 4, then actually I couldn't be wrong about it, right? In the sense that there's no possibility that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. So as long as my belief is coordinated with the truth there, even if that's by chance or something, then the content of my belief, there's no possibility of that being wrong. So in that sense, there's no possibility of me being wrong. So it's, if you like, in that kind of metaphysical sense, it is known with 100%. Well, it's 100% certainly true or whatever, right? And if I know it, then I know it, and it's 100% certain. But presumably, Sye wants to mean something more like you believe it, and you have some kind of confidence interval, which is like maxed out. unless I'm 100% confident about the proposition, then I don't know it at all. But I could be 100% confident about something and it'd be right, and that's true for him as well. Confidence isn't the same as certainty in the sense of feeling confident about it doesn't actually entail that it's true. You can be supremely confident about something that's false. Like I think he's supremely confident about something that's false. It's just that he doesn't think that well, I don't understand why he thinks so he thinks unless you have someone telling you what the truth is or whatever, then you can't know it. But I mean, anyone can tell anyone anything and be wrong about it. Nothing logically prevents even a deity who whispers in your ear or whatever from telling you something false. I mean, he might even be perfectly good and do that because you might have some morally sufficient reason for all you know, etc. So it doesn't even, like, I don't know, it's kind of just, well, everything is wrong about it. There's nothing right about that argument at all. So no, I don't think it's a valid way of putting it. I think it's probably one of the worst presuppositionalists, I guess. I mean, there's people who don't know what they're talking about at all, but I mean, he's been doing it for years. I guess Ray Comfort's worse, actually. But yeah, Sye Ten Bruggencate is not good at this.
Wait, you think that Ray Comfort is worse than Sye Ten?
Yeah, I think so.
That's hilarious. Yeah, so we have a question. Actually, yes. What is your objection to Leibniz's cosmological argument? I can't remember who asked it, but yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, I haven't looked at this in any detail, so I don't have a very informed view of this, apart from to say that I think that in recent decades, it's become fairly widely acknowledged that the strong versions of the principle of sufficient reason are actually too strong, and that they're implausibly strong. So there's this argument which people trace back to different places, but I think of it as Van Inwagen's argument, which is that basically so the idea is a strong version of the principle of sufficient says every contingent truth, let's say, proposition, fact, whatever, every contingent proposition has an explanation. And what it means to say that it has an explanation is that there's another proposition which entails that it's true. And so explanation, sufficient reason, means sufficient for it to be true. It's a sufficient condition. So it entails that it's true. Now, if that's the notion of principle of sufficient reason that you've got, then Van Inwagen's argument shows you that not every contingent proposition can have an explanation in that sense. See if I can recall exactly how it goes. So if Christ, I reckon Jack can probably remember this better than I can.
Well, I know you're talking about the modal.
There's the big conjunctive contingent fact.
The big conjunctive contingent fact. Yeah. Right.
And so the question is whether, if in fact a necessary being explains that, right, it's just going to entail it, in which case the big conjunctive contingent fact is necessary.
Yeah.
And so then all facts are necessary. I think that's the basic idea.
Yeah, the basic idea is just that if the explanation relation is that strong, and what's at the base of all of the explanations is something that's necessarily true, then basically because nothing contingently true is ever entailed by something that's necessarily true. Like if you've got a necessary truth like 2 + 2 = 4, it can't be like a logical consequence of that necessary truth that this glass right now happens to just have this much beer in it, which is contingent, right? Because that glass could have had like slightly more beer in it, or not existed at all, or whatever. It's like a contingently existing, it's a contingently true proposition, and there's no way that that can be a logical consequence of a proposition which is necessarily true, right? Like the consequence relation is kind of closed under necessity, is what logician would say. All of its consequences are necessary. None of its consequences are contingent. So if the ultimate explanation of everything is necessary, then everything is necessary. Otherwise, if the ultimate explanation of things is not necessary, then there's something contingent, which isn't explained by anything else, because that's the ultimate explanation of it. So you've either got no necessity at all, no contingency at all, and all necessity, or some unexplained contingency. And that basically screws the really strong version of the principle of sufficient reason. And since then, the literature is about weaker versions. And now it's much less clear what to say about those, because there's a whole landscape of them, and they all say slightly different things to each other. But if it's fair to say that Leibniz's principle is the strong one, and I'm not enough of an expert at all on Leibniz to know whether he had a nuanced version or if he endorsed the strong version. If he endorsed the strong version, then I think it falls prey to this Van Inwagen argument.
No, I see. Yeah, I forgot who wanted to get on mic, but yeah, there is a question from Haiku. I think there's a couple, but I'm just going to read one second. However, in some of your AMAs, you go over certain views in the metaphysics of modality, such as moral realism, Platonism, etc. What sort of view do you lean towards, if any, and why?
On what though? On
metaphysics of modality.
The metaphysics of modality. Well, so I like this branching view, which I sort of gestured towards at the beginning when I was talking about Grim Reaper stuff. So the thought is that my PhD was on branching time and the connection between modality and time, basically. So the idea that I think what the key thought is that possible worlds approaches to modality in the sort of mold of David Lewis take your kind of element in the possible world in the modal space to be a world, right? And by a world they mean a sort of four-dimensional space-time, like a one way things could have been, right? Which specifies everything completely about what way things could have gone. And the idea is just that there's loads of islands of possibility like that, and then in each world everything that's true is just a kind of straightforward categorical fact about like this particle's over there and that particle's over there, and this is brown and that's green and blah blah blah. And then when you come to say something modal about like it's possible, this is blue but it could have been green, what you're doing then is you're saying that there's some other world where it is green, and that's kind of the basic structure of how David Lewis looks at it. But I suppose my starting point with this is to say that there's a sense in which possibilities change over time that's not very well modeled there, because what's true, what's out there in the space of possible worlds is just always there. It's always unchanging. So, for instance, let's say I could have been a prodigal chess player as a child. Let's pretend. But obviously now it's not possible for me to be a prodigal child chess player because I'm already an adult. So it's too late for that to happen. And what's going on there is there used to be a live possibility back when I was a child, and then time passed and that possibility stopped being live and became like dead or something, like is no longer there. Now, how do you model that in possible worlds talk? Well, all you can really do is sort of in your mind group together possible worlds which were identical up to a certain point in time, like when I became an adult, let's say, I don't know, my 18th birthday or something. All those worlds which are identical up to that point, or all worlds which overlapped with my life up to a certain point and then differed from it, where like I went off and had chess lessons or something and became good at chess. You know, maybe I did that when I was 10 or something. So you could compare in your head worlds where they were identical with each other up to a certain point, and then they become gradually more and more different from each other. So the relation that you're using to compare worlds is just similarity and difference. And that's fine. It's just similarity and difference is like not really there, right? So there's nothing that actually connects those worlds. Really, they're just completely distinct from each other. And what that does is it means it's kind of an unsatisfying account of, you know, because when we come back to it, I was thinking, well, it really was possible for me to become, say, really good at chess as a kid. That doesn't just seem like somebody looking at the worlds would deem those two to be similar and gradually less and less similar as after a certain point or something. The similarity doesn't seem to capture it very well. So I guess I just had this like intuition or thought or something that there's a different way, there should be a different way of doing it, which takes a different starting point. And it turned out that there kind of was already a tradition where people were working on that, which goes back to really early work of Kripke and another guy, Arthur Pryor, where they were looking at possible worlds. You know, this is in the 50s before the possible world stuff became settled, and they were looking at it in terms of different models. And one of them was a tree, where what a logician means by a tree is like a partially ordered set where the ordering relation is irreflexive, basically. So it means that there's, you can think of it as like imagine flipping a coin 10 times, right? And drawing out the possibilities. Like you probably did this when you were in school. And like the first flip, there's 2 possibilities. And then the second flip, you know, you have to think there's 4 possibilities because it's all the possibilities of the first flip and the possibilities of the second flip. And so in the third flip, there's 8 possibilities, and it's always doubling every time because there's 2 options. And you would naturally draw that in by what a logician would call a tree. So it's like fork to begin with into 2, and then each of those forks would fork themselves into 2, and you'd have 4 different branches, and then each of those would fork again, and it would be 8 different branches. And that is the model that people would use. That's a branching time model, where you're saying, look, the possibilities emerge over time, whatever. And then at the beginning of the tree, you know, the trunk or whatever, all of the branches are possible. And what that means is that, you know, they're continuations of the way that things actually are. You know, that it could go this way, it could go that way. But as you go up the tree, you can sort of look over the other side of the tree at different branches, and they're now no longer live possibilities. The live possibilities are just the ones that are in the future. So you can sort of distinguish, but there's a sort of satisfying geometrical explanation of what it means for, as time passes, different possibilities become inaccessible to you. And it also helps to ground claims about like counterfactuals, like, you know, the coin landed heads now, but it could have landed tails, means that, you know, some point in the past there was a live possibility for tails. Like what happens is basically a consequence of the view is that all possible worlds literally overlap with the actual world at some point in the past. And that's what I was saying about before. That's what it means to be metaphysically possible, is this like connection between time and modality. So, I mean, I can talk a lot more about that, of course, but that's my basic view, I guess.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the explanation, Dr. Malpass. Concrete Plus would like to ask you, oh, where did he go? I guess he disappeared. Okay. Well, a second. Oh, Concrete just disappeared. Okay, then it's Raskolnikov who wants to know, if the cause of the universe is necessary, doesn't that commit us to the view that everything in the universe is necessary and couldn't have been otherwise?
I mean, it depends what you mean by cause, I suppose. Causal relation doesn't have to be. I mean, you could get like an indeterministic cause. So, I mean, maybe the first cause is some kind of indeterministic process that leads to things that, well, lots of different things that could happen. In which case there could be a first cause, but things not be necessary. So it's a bit like what I was saying before. If your principle of sufficient reason has an entailment relation, then yeah, then there's only one way things could go. If there's a first kind of necessary thing at the beginning. If causation means that the cause entails the effect, then fair enough. But if you have a weaker relation, if cause just makes effect more probable or something, or something along those lines, then no, you could have a cause and there could be lots of contingency still.
I see. Thank you so much for the explanation. Concrete is back. Concrete, go ahead.
Hello, sir. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
What's your strongest argument against the existence of the Christian God?
I'm not sure that I have really anything that's like that. I don't really. So, do I have a? I don't claim to have like a knockdown argument that will, prove Christianity is not true. Okay, so if that's what you're after, you're not going to be very satisfied by what I'll say. But I mean, I guess I find lots of aspects of Christianity problematic, which isn't quite the same as saying it's my best argument against it. Some of it's interestingly problematic and some of it's not interesting. It's still problematic. So let's see. I guess I don't understand the notion of the Incarnation, for one thing. I don't understand the notion of the Trinity. I don't think either of those make any sense. I don't understand the message of salvation that Christianity teaches. I don't understand the notion of the afterlife that it offers.
Okay.
I don't understand the notion of the moral theory that underlines it. Doesn't make any sense either. So, they're not arguments to show that it's false, but they're reasons why I don't think that it's true. I think that it's very confusing and implausible.
Can we start with Incarnation? Incarnation, can you tell me what you find problematic about that?
Okay, so I guess what I mean by that is Jesus's nature. I don't understand what it means to say Jesus's nature is both fully human and fully divine. So there's kind of the Nicene Creed.
Okay.
I mean, it seems to me that I don't really know what a nature is, for one thing, but it seems to me that if
he has two natures.
He has two natures, yeah. But that's like saying that something is green all over and red all over. In my head, it's what it sounds like. So I just don't understand how something can be colored in two ways all over. That's what it sounds like to say that something has two natures.
Well, if we look at a dictionary definition of nature, one of them is the inherent aspect of something. And I guess if you wanted to talk about the duality of someone's nature, if that's an inherent aspect, we can look at being, let's say, altruistic versus selfish. And those are two natures which would be a part of the human being and can be either exhibited at different times within the human being. So this person could exhibit a altruistic nature or a selfish nature. And I think,
I cut off for me.
Yeah, I got a phone call. But what I'm saying is that it'll be easier to understand Jesus if you just understand the duality of human nature or complexity of human nature, and all the different dispositions that you could behave within.
Okay, so I mean, I do understand that people can have, you can be selfish in some respects, or you can be selfish today and generous tomorrow. And what I don't understand is that, I mean, I don't take it, maybe you can correct me, but it doesn't seem to me that the resolution of the Nicene Creed is that Jesus is godly today and human tomorrow, or godly with respect to you and human with respect to me. It's just that he's fully God and fully man. And in that respect, it's not the same. So how is the duality analogy in human personality? It would be like saying that I'm both selfish and generous in the same respect at the same time, and that doesn't make sense either.
Well, I wouldn't want you to limit the concept with just that, isolate the concept and its abilities to just that example. That would be a mistake, right? So there are some, so if you looked at it as if they were mutually exclusive, where you couldn't be generous and selfish at the same time, there is some things that are simultaneous. So with regards to God's nature, he can be godly and have the aspects of manhood simultaneously. And it wouldn't be with respects to a person, it would just be, I guess you could call it his ontology.
But all you're doing is appealing to simultaneity. So can something be simultaneously red all over, blue all over?
Well, you don't have to look at the concept in that regard, because again, that would just be a limitation based on that example, based on that analogy. And so what I can say is that there is a duality of man such that he is a spirit and he is also flesh. And so within the spirit, you could be godly, within the flesh, you're manly. And that would be simultaneous.
Well, but then, okay, so first of all, you offered me the duality of man, as in, we're nice and not nice, and that's what it's like. And I replied that, the duality of the psyche or whatever is actually nice on Monday and not nice on Tuesday. Always resolved down with respect to something. And given that, that's not the way that the man and godliness in the Nicene Creed is supposed to be understood. The analogy doesn't help. Then you brought in the notion of simultaneity, and I just questioned, how does that help? Because, I mean, with the red all over and green all over, adding simultaneity in there doesn't seem to do anything, doesn't explain anything to me anyway. But now you're talking about the kind of dual aspect, as in both physical and spiritual. But assuming you're Christian, I have no idea who you are, but presuming you're a Christian, have a straightforward look of things, you probably just believe that normal, regular people have a soul and a body. So in that sense, what are we supposed to take it that they're also God and man? I mean, otherwise you're explaining what's the godly aspect in addition to just being, a mind and a body. That's just a different duality. You're just not really addressing the context here. So you're giving me lots and lots of stuff, but I don't think that any of it's addressing the issue, which I think is just not supposed to be explained in terms of anything else. You just have to kind of accept that there's one thing which is both fully man and fully God, and that's Jesus, and nothing else is like that. And you can sort of give these like poetic analogies if you want, but if you want a philosophical analysis of what it means, there just isn't one. I think that's the simplest way to understand the doctrine. It's not supposed to be subjected to philosophical analysis, right? It's just a religious idea that doesn't have a coherent cashing out, really. When you look at it, it's just lots of poetic stuff you say about it. But I'm thinking about it as a philosopher, right? That's why it's unsatisfying to me. So anyway, we're not going to settle this question, but hopefully you can understand where I'm coming from, right?
No, I don't, because you don't have to look at it within the constraints of can you be blue and red at the same time. That is just what you're doing is you're trying to understand the concept, but you're limiting it to that let's say set of characteristics. So imagine I was trying to explain a car to you and you didn't understand cars. And so I said, with the car, you have the ability, and we'll just say the abilities are the different natures of the car. So you can go forward and you can go backwards. And you say, okay, cool, I understand that. But you can't go forward, you can't go backwards at the same time. And I'll say, yeah, that's cool, that's true. But also an aspect of this car is that it can also change your environment and the temperature within the car. It can make it hot or it can make it cold. But it's not going to be hot and cold at the same time. It's going to be one or the other. It's not going to be going forward and backward at the same time. It's going to be one or the other. But it can be cold and going forward at the same time. So that's the simultaneous nature of the car that you're trying to understand, right? And you understand it in car terms because you understand what a car is, and it's not controversial for you to make these pronouncements about the car. There's no greater social implications. So I think if you took that same charitable approach to God, where there is no additional baggage with understanding God's duality or nature, then I think you can understand it.
Okay, so let's see if I understand what you're proposing now is to say the two natures of Jesus are to be reconciled by thinking of them as properties that are not mutually exclusive, right? So something could be round and red at the same time, right? No problem. Of course, something could be round and red. And being divine, fully divine and being fully human is just like saying something is round and red, or warm and going forwards, or whatever your example was. And that would be fine, apart from the fact that, that seems to massively distort the notion of the concepts that are in play. Being divine isn't compatible with being human, right? It's not my concept, it's the religious concept, but being God is other to being human. There's a creator-creature distinction. Just saying that it's just two compatible properties, you can just be both creator and creature at the same time, like you can be both round and red at the same time. How is that? I want you to explain what that means to have both of them. Those natures are not just straightforwardly compatible.
All right, great. That should be easy to deal with, because what it means to be a human is to have a spirit, have a body, and exist here now on earth, right? So
what does
God,
it mean to be divine?
What it would mean to be divine is to have the spirit and abilities of a divine entity. So all I could do is offer you a definition, because I couldn't offer you the experience, nor could I try to explain the experience to you, because I'm not divine. But I could offer the definition that divinity would just be a separate category. It could be the same material as a spirit, if we want to use material and spirits in the same way, as the same thing. It could be the same material as a spirit, but just a higher grade of spirit.
But look, hold on a second. Let's just make this straightforward. If you're divine, right, then you're not created. If you're human, then you are created. But if you're fully divine and fully human, then you're fully created and you're fully not created. And I just don't understand how that's coherent.
No, you don't have to think of it as fully, because we understand that there's different components that work together to form this particular entity, which would be Jesus. So one component is the eternal spirit that has always existed, and the second component is the corporeal body. So those two things come together to make Jesus, and there you go.
I think he's just not using a Nicene.
That's irrelevant. That's irrelevant.
Well, I don't think it's
trying to
irrelevant, but I
understand
think,
the concept.
yeah, so I think there were loads of different. The history of Christianity has lots of phases where people voiced those types of, well, we could resolve it like this, and that's what the early heresies were about. And there's churches split from one another, and Christians fought each other over it, and there were councils called in order to try and bring the church back together again, because they disagreed so violently over what the nature of Christ was. And the one that won out, the one that traditional Christianity today is the one where Jesus is fully God and fully man. And it's not the one where they compromise and say, all right, so he's like a bit God and a bit man, or something like that, where the other ways of rationalizing it, they thought those were heresies, because to some extent they made a compromise about the divine nature of Jesus. Is to say he's not fully divine, is to say that he isn't, maximally godlike or something, right? So, but at any point when you want to try and rationalize this into something that makes sense, someone else is going to say that that's a heresy, because you're like giving ground on some, aspect of this that you can't compromise on. And the one that won out is the one that doesn't compromise on either of them, and just says, even though it's really difficult to explain what that means, there is no compromise between them. He's just fully both, right? But the problem is, great if you're winning, if you're playing a game of like doctrinal or ideological one-upmanship, or if there's a power struggle where the person with the most extreme views, the most, the most extreme view tends to like sort of float to the top or whatever, that's kind of an explanation of why we get to the position that we're in. But it's just not a philosophical analysis of what that concept is. Now, it's okay if you just have a different conception, which is one of these other ones that's like, he isn't fully man, or he's fully man on a Wednesday, or something like that. I'm kind of okay with that, but that's just not what I meant by Christianity in the first place. I think you'd have a nuanced view. You might even have a view that other Christians called heretical or whatever. So, I mean, let's just keep the goalpost fixed. If we're talking about just straightforward Nicene Creed, that is what it says. And that's the view I'm saying is problematic.
We're talking about conceptualizing God. You said incarnation. You didn't. So if we deal with incarnation, we're just simply saying that the Spirit of God inhabited a body and was birthed through a womb. And I think that that's pretty straightforward. And you said that, how could he be fully God and fully man at the same time? Mm-hmm. And we just divide them into two separate components, one being the spirit, one being the body. And that's how that is accomplished. And now you're appealing to heresies or not, I'm not sure. But that's irrelevant to understanding the concept, because a heresy is just going to be the opinion of one Christian or theologian or observer versus another. Now, they're going to say that their opinion is better for whatever reasons. Maybe they're going to say they're inspired by God. Maybe they're going to say that they have, a better underlying evidence or argument for it. Irrespective of all of that, until God sits down and tells us all how it was done, we are free to make arguments and discussions about how it could be. So bringing up heresy is irrelevant.
Okay, so I see where you're coming from. So, okay, in that sense, I did say incarnation at the beginning, and I think because I was thinking on my feet, and I think where I was going with it was this specific doctrine that at least I associate with Christianity, which is, I think, also sometimes called the hypostatic union, whatever. I think there's a problematic aspect there, which I associate with Christianity. But on the other hand, if we're just thinking about incarnation in a much more general sense, actually, I don't find that problematic. I think that I could take control of like a robot or something from like a virtual reality, like headset or whatever, like a drone or something, and just pilot that from a distance. And now, in a sense, it's an incarnation of me. Like I'm moving it around and it's doing stuff. And like, if that's what you mean, I don't have a problem with that. But I think the problem comes in when you try to say something. I mean, on that view, if that's what was going on, then, you'd have to cash it out a bit. But like, was Jesus a man with his own mind up till he was up till his baptism? Or it depends which version of it you read, right? But at some point, God comes to him and says, I think in Mark, comes to him and says basically that he's chosen Jesus. And at that point, is it like me piloting the drone or whatever? Like, what happens to Jesus's independent will and conscious experience at that point is if it's incarnated literally, like the way that I'm talking about, by another's mind, that makes sense to me. But like, I just don't think that's the view of Christianity about what happened to Jesus when whatever happened to him. And in fact, I think the story as it develops through the Bible becomes that Jesus wasn't actually picked on a given day to be the chosen, person of God's favor or whatever, but there was divine from birth. In fact, before birth, he's always been divine. He's a divine entity itself, just like God, equal to God. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, I'm not just making stuff up like that's nothing to do with Christianity. Presumably you recognize the types of things that I'm saying. They are part of Christianity. And those are the things that are difficult to reconcile with any straightforward model of incarnation where you just say, oh, there's a mind in a body. That's not difficult to explain. I mean, that's fine. It's just effectively we've got, a normal human body with a normal human mind and soul or whatever, but there's also something divine about them. And what does that mean? Right? That, I think you're underplaying the difficulty of resolving the aspect of being both human and divine. And we can keep talking about this forever. We're not going to settle it. I at least acknowledge that there's difficulties. I'm not trying to say prove that this is definitely doomed to fail or something, but I think it's explain this with just a passing analogy or something. I think that just downplays the complexity there. I completely respect your view. I'm not trying to persuade you out of your religious outlook or something. It doesn't bother me what you think, but yeah.
If I may, it seems that you're okay with incarnation now, and now you're moving, or you're overlaying the Trinity onto incarnation, and that seems to be the new issue. Is that what's happening?
I don't think I'm changing the issue. I think at the very beginning, and I tried to say, I always had in mind, although I was thinking the notion of this Nicene Creed or hypostatic union. And like I've said all along, the issue is about being all man, all human and all divine. That's the combination that I find problematic. I don't think
I thought I resolved that by just looking at God as being his spirit, all God, and his body, all human, in which case you've got two components with one entity.
Yeah, well, but I said to you, don't you think that normal human body...
Excuse me?
Well, we're going over this again. I asked you, don't you think that all humans have a spirit as well, right? So
yes. Okay,
so in what sense are you resolving things? You're just saying that this one who has a spirit and a body, what's the... So, sorry, on a normal human's case, right? What's my human nature? Is it my body that grounds my human nature?
You're just presuming.
Well, I've done 2 hours, so I think I'm going to do about 10 minutes more, and then that's probably going to be it. I mean, there's a ton, right? So you'd have to spell one out in particular, but very quickly, so Graham Oppy's book on philosophical perspectives on infinity has a whole chapter discussing the different ways that you could make precise the notion of the principle of sufficient reason in different ways, and he basically offers a schema and then fills in the variables in different ways. And I think that, and I think he agrees with me about this because we've had conversations about it in the past, but once you weaken the explanatory relation from logical entailment to something else, something weaker, then it becomes difficult to understand why what that relation is should be called explanation at all, or at least maybe that's not fair. But what happens is you end up being able to satisfy that with things, which then provide counterexamples to the basic claim of the contingency argument. So, for instance, we're going to say something like every contingent proposition has an explanation, but the explanations are not things that logically entail those things, right? So let's say an explanation could be of this sort, like you're in a casino and you observe a roulette table landing like 00, right? And let's pretend that it's completely random that happened, 1 in 36 chance or whatever it is, but it's not like secretly determined or whatever. Now, you might say, well, why did that land? It's a contingent proposition that it just landed 00. Why did that happen? What's the explanation for that? Now, on this weak notion, nothing's going to entail that happened, but there'll be something else which is true, which gives something else other than entailment. And you might just say, well, it's a casino. Stuff like this happens in a casino, right? Like the table is round and it's got 36 different spaces in it, and the ball was spinning and it had to land somewhere, and there was a 1 in 36 chance of it landing there, and so it did. And that's the explanation of it. I mean, those are the sorts of things that you have to, they're not at all the types of things that the traditional cosmological argument would be looking at. But if those types of things are what we mean by sort of non-entailing explanation, a sufficient reason that's kind of sufficient enough or something, then it just feels like, so for instance, take the guy who's counting down forever and finishes counting now. Craig says, it violates the principle of sufficient reason because there's no reason that guy would finish counting down now rather than some other time. But because we're not talking about the strong notion of explanation anymore, all we have to do is come up with some context that provides at least a probabilistic grounding for that thing happening, just like we did in the casino case. And then you can just say, well, if the past is infinite, that sort of thing is possible. I mean, anyone could be finishing an infinite countdown at any point, right? That's what it's like to be in an infinite past. And so the notion of explanation is so weak there that it seems actually satisfiable in that context. So I guess, to cut a long story short, if you weaken the notion of explanation, then you can have them for those things that theists would otherwise say couldn't be explained without, or would be violations of principle of sufficient reason. They basically stop being. So you need it to be strong enough to generate a problem in the first place. But if it's too strong, then you have Van Inwagen's problem. And if it's too weak, you have the type of problem I was just explaining. So the quest is to find something in the middle. And it's an open question, I think.
Yeah, hi, Alex.
Hi.
Yes, what's up?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, hi, Alex.
Hi.
So, in your thesis against William Lane Craig, you actually argue that the past is at least possibly actually infinite. And I read the paper and I was interested because you say in there that it's actually impossible to count to infinity by counting each and every finite number. But to me, it seems that saying that the current moment is an instance of an infinite series, to me seems equivalent to saying that you've counted up to an infinite by counting each and every finite moment, which seems to be a contradiction. So I'm not sure if that's the case or if that is a problem.
Okay, so I'm not sure if you were here earlier on, but
I wasn't.
was making a distinction between counting up and counting down. And, if someone says, why is it impossible to count to infinity? One way of understanding that is by saying, if I start counting now, I'll always be counting a finite number, some finite number. I'll never be counting anything other than a finite number. So I'll never count to infinity or something. Well, that's the general idea.
Yeah.
And what that seems to mean is that you're never going to get to the end of this sequence, right? It's a sequence with a beginning, but it's a sequence that doesn't have an end. And what the problem that's being pointed to is that you can't get to the end of something that doesn't have an end, right? And
Exactly.
now,
Right.
fine, okay, but now if we turn our attention towards the infinite past, it's not a thing that has a beginning but no end. It's a thing that has an end but no beginning. And now, if we want to know what's the problem here, it can't be that we can't get to the end of something which doesn't have an end, because it does have an end. What we need is a different problem. So what I'm asking for, and I don't see, is for people like William Lane Craig to explain why you can't count down from infinity without talking about why you can't count up to infinity, because actually you don't get, even if you could establish you can't count to infinity, you can't then go, therefore you can't count down from infinity. That inference, there's no mirror principle of logic that tells you that because even if the first one was true, that the second one would be true. That's not a logical inference. It's just, we need actually a distinct argument that supports the thought that you can't count down. And those simple observations about not being able to count up are basically irrelevant.
Well, the difficulty is I don't think that there's a way to actually define transfinite decrementation. I don't think that's yet been shown.
Well, I'm actually
I don't think that
you need to have transfinite anything. So if somebody's been counting down forever, you don't need to suppose that they've ever been counting anything other than a finite. So it's not transfinite.
No. But if you're counting down from infinity, you're essentially beginning with infinity and ending.
No. You're not beginning. There's no beginning.
You would have to.
What do you mean?
I mean, it's a process, and a process. I mean, I would say it at least has to start. It's not like processes just spawn out of nothingness.
It's not out of nothingness. It's that it's always been happening. For every point in time, there's an earlier time where you were already counting. I mean, it's just the mirror image of counting up, right? Because presumably you concede readily that you can't count to infinity in the sense that there's no end to that process. And actually what's happening there is for every moment in that sequence, there's another one that you haven't done yet. And I'm suggesting, we're not saying that there's an infinite number anywhere on that sequence of counting up, right? It's not transfinite, it's just all of the finite numbers. Now, all I'm saying is exact mirror opposite of counting down forever.
I think that only
hypothesis in question.
So I think that only works if you admit completed infinities. So there's a distinction between potential infinities and completed infinities. So if you were to understand the process as a potential infinity, then the mirror, there's no mirror there. That's only true if you consider these kinds of processes as completed infinities.
So you said at the beginning that you read my paper. So
Yeah.
Which paper of mine was it that you read?
The one about William Lane Craig. This was about a year ago. I think you actually, even in the last few sentences, appealed to some people who hold to these arguments. I just don't know if you ever addressed it in any of your further papers.
So the paper that I published last year with Wes Morriston on the Kalam, and I just published one the other day, and those are the only two. So I assume it wasn't the one from the other day. So in that paper, we were at pains to distinguish. I mean, we head-on addressed the actual potential distinction. So I think, because I'm basically about to go to bed, I would suggest that you look up the paper. It's called Endless and Infinite, and have a look at the section there, where for about I don't know, a number of pages, I go into quite a lot of detail about exactly why what you just said then doesn't help at all. The distinction between the actual and potential infinite doesn't make any difference to this. It's actually just a kind of red herring. And in fact, also in the most recent paper too, I suppose. So both of them have passage. In fact, just give me 1 second. I'll put a link to the PDF in the chat so you can read it. Because it's about exactly this.
Yeah, I must have missed it then, because I'll admit that I did just kind of take a quick look at it. I didn't read it in depth. So I'm just.
If you read it a year ago, then fair enough.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so if you're saying that the potential actual distinction doesn't help the issue, I'll have to consider that then.
Yeah, I mean, I would just suggest reading the.
Okay. Yeah, I'll read that. I'll read that part in. Yeah, I'll read that part in detail then. Okay.
Okay, I'm just exporting this PDF and then I'm going to put it in the chat. Done, because I've been 2 hours and a bit now.
Excellent. I appreciate the time, and I'll make sure to read that part in detail.
Cool.
All right. Thanks. All right. Thanks for the answer.
No trouble.
I think Alex. The best thing about this is just watching Alex get tormented.
Well, I mean, could you?
What you enjoy?
I mean, could you maybe just outline a sketch?
Sorry, you cut off there. Is it? Is that Ace?
You got cut off, Ace.
Could you just outline a sketch, just maybe in rough strokes, kind of?
So, look, so what does it mean to be a potential infinite, right? It means that there's a process which is endlessly increasing whilst remaining finite, but approaching infinity without ever getting there, right? That's what Craig means by a potential infinite. And he says when you count up to infinity, you're counting potentially infinitely, but you're not counting actually infinitely. And what does he mean by an actual infinite? He means it's a set of elements which can be placed in a one-to-one correspondence with one of its proper parts, right? So like the natural numbers and the even numbers or something. So that's what mathematicians call Dedekind infinite. Now, the whole point here is that if you get your tenses straight, they're not actually mutually exclusive, right? Because let's say I start counting now, and in the paper, the original one, I've just sent you the most recent one, but I also discussed basically the same point of one aspect of it. But look, let's say I start counting now. Right? I count 1, 2, 3, blah blah blah. Right? Let's think of the number of numbers that I will have counted at any point in my journey. So when I'm counted up to the number 10, how many numbers will I have counted at that point? And the answer is 10 numbers. Right? At time 1,000,000, how many will I have? It would be 1,000,000 numbers. Blah blah blah, right? So the thought is the question, how many numbers will I have, is always finite. Is there a top limit to the number I will have counted up to? No, there isn't. It goes on endlessly. Will it ever be finite? Will it ever be infinite? No, it won't. So this is a potential infinite, the amount of numbers that I will have counted to at each point in time, right? And that's called a future perfect tense, is a combination of will and was. Right, it will be the case that it has been the case that I've counted 10 numbers, right? It's a kind of complex future and past tense construction. Now, on the other hand, consider how many numbers will I count? And that's a different question, right? And that is effectively just asking how many numbers are there left to count, right? And if I've counted up to 10, let me just get to the end of this and then...
Okay, yeah.
Right, if I've counted up to 10, how many numbers have I got left to count? It's not 10. It's infinite. It's infinity minus 10, which is infinity, right? It's the same amount of numbers still to count as I started with. And if I've counted up to 1,000,000, the amount of numbers I've still got left to count is still infinite, right? So if we just ask the straightforward future tense question, how many numbers will I count? Then it's infinitely many. If we ask the future perfect question, how many numbers will I have counted? It's a potential infinite. Now, that's the distinction. You don't just pick between it's only a potential infinite and not an actual. That's just to misunderstand the concepts here. There's always both of those in play, and they're in fact two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. So that's why it doesn't help to distinguish between them. All you're doing is saying, if I say, this guy's going to count endlessly and never finish, how many numbers will he count? And you say, oh, potentially infinitely many. I'm going to point out that you're actually answering a question. If I said, how many numbers will he have counted? Okay, that's potentially infinitely many, but that's not what I asked. I said, how many numbers will he count? And actually, he'll count all of the numbers, right? Because he'll never finish. For each number, he will count that one. So again, look at the paper in more detail. You asked for a thumbnail sketch of how the potential and actual infinite doesn't help the person making Craig's argument. And that's the thumbnail sketch.
Right, and I'm not defending Craig's argument either. I do remember the modal scope issues, and I remember agreeing with you about the modal scope issues actually. It's just I didn't know that your AMA was today, so otherwise I actually was prepared to talk to you about this for your last AMA, but my question never got answered or asked by Venus. So I just log in and I see you on today, so I'm not very well prepared.
That's all right. No, don't worry.
But,
I mean, it's,
I appreciate it.
It's cool to ask about it. But yeah, that's the.
Unfortunately, you'll never get another chance.
Yeah, exactly.
This is the last
ever.
AMA Alex is ever.
I don't blame him. I don't blame him one bit.
But yeah, read the paper.
So the older paper and then this new one as well, right?
That's right. They're both basically two parts of a research project that was one big investigation into this.
Because I remember I watched your interview on the democracy of the dead, and I do, like I said, I do remember agreeing with you about this like modal scope issue, but still having maybe some difficulties with the distinction between potential and infinite. And I didn't know that you went over it in detail in your first paper, so I'll have to reread that.
Yeah,
section.
And I have a third paper that still, I mean, it's kicking around, but there. Look, the basic idea is that so there's this binary notion, potential infinite. But actually, there's a whole ton of ways that those, at least the potential infinite, can be unpacked. And it's true, scope distinctions make all the difference. And actually, you can, there's at least, I mean, it's a combination of, I think there's probably 3 operators, and how many combinations can they be? Then if there's 3, was that 9 different ways you can arrange those in scope? Some of them are basically meaningless, but there's subtle distinctions between them about what that actually is saying. I mean, hopefully I'll get that one out at some point, but it sort of destroys the notion. I mean, and Oppie does a good job of this as well, but that there's this simple idea, certainly, of a potential infinite. It's just one thing, and that's that. When you actually become like clear about it, there are lots of different things it could mean, and depending on one of these subtle notions of scope that are employed, they have different implications. So I actually don't think there's a clean distinction there. Just one thing.
I'd be sympathetic to a position like that.
Yeah, and I mean, look, Craig doesn't really define these things properly in the first place. And thinks that the notion of potential infinite is very widely accepted because it's used in things like mathematics where you have limits or whatever. But in actual fact, there's quite a large amount of controversy in philosophy of mathematics, and all of this stuff is up in the air. And there's a big tradition of people who are very skeptical that there is a notion of the potential infinite, because there's a period in Cantor's life where he was skeptical that there was one. And there's this famous letter to another mathematician where he expresses this view about what's come to be known as the domain principle. And, there's a bunch of people called actualists who basically take that view, and they don't think that there's any sensible notion of the potential infinite whatsoever, right? So
right.
Yeah, it's not so much not a helpful thing to appeal to, but I think there isn't a proper notion that everybody agrees. And if you just take Craig's notion, it just obviously no help whatsoever to strengthen that case. It's obvious the clearest thing about that it doesn't help.
Yeah, I was less interested in the particular connections with Craig and just more interested in about like the actual parts about it, formalizing infinity. So that's where my interest is coming from.
Yeah, the actual infinite is much more straightforward in terms of formalization than the potential. Although there's some interesting stuff from Stuart Shapiro and Øystein Limbo recently, where they are formalizing a notion of potential infinite. That's super interesting. But that's.
Yeah, I don't know, because I would feel my intuition is the opposite. I would feel that the potential infinity is easier to formalize, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's inexpressible in set theory. I mean,
well, set theory already admits completed infinities kind of out the gate already.
Yeah,
in that sense. So yeah,
That's
well,
right.
I mean, yeah.
But yeah, it's late, so I'm gonna call it an evening if that's all right with you guys.